To people who've lived in a rough neighborhood, places with gang violence and stuff, what challenges did you face on a day-to-day basis? What experiences have stayed with you? The biggest thing for my ignorant teenage self was that nobody would want to drive me home because they'd be too scared. Once a friend's car broke down in my neighborhood and got guns pulled on him. Guess who never got rides again after that? Never giving passerbys on sidewalks a moment or a reason to continue a conversation. A frequent thing would be people heckling me as I walked to/ from school. Hey man, can I use your phone? I don't have a phone without slowing down. And things like that. Day to day isn't terrible. Keep your head down and keep moving. Also be polite to your neighbors and you won't have any real trouble. Only real experience that has stayed with me is that when I hear yelling / shouting outside I don't react anymore. Didn't live in one of those areas, but frequently worked in them. I worked for a government program which provided certain home improvements at no cost to those income qualified. Windows, doors, insulation, roofs. Because of the nature of the program, I often worked in bad areas and a lot of Section 8 projects. We have a generator on the back of our truck that we use daily. The power supply in most of these rundown homes wasn't enough to support our tools. As you can imagine, the generator is pretty loud. A lot of the time, you'd hear it sputter and kick on and off. This usually meant some debris / dirt got into the fuel filter. No problem. Clean it out and start it back up again. One morning, we fire up the generator and get to work. While I'm 12 feet up on a ladder, installing a bathroom fan vent, I hear the generator start to slowly quiet down. I roll my eyes, because I know I'll have to get down, go out front to the truck and clean the filter. But since at that particular moment I wasn't using a tool, just a caulk gun, I figure fuck it, I'll do it when I'm done here. But then the generator makes a faint noise, and gets fainter and fainter. I knew something was up. I get down from the ladder and go out front. About 5 houses away on the sidewalk are 2 gentlemen trying their best to run away with our generator while it was still on. The thing weighs about 300 pounds and is awkward as fuck to carry, even with 2 people. The strain and back crippling run they were doing was impressive. I really couldn't even be mad. I caught up with them, tried to stop them. One guy had a screwdriver he was threatening me with. I backed off and called the cops. They caught up with them a block later. They weren't hard to find. They ended up getting charged with robbery and both went to the hospital. They both had severe burns on their arms and legs from the exhaust on the machine rubbing up against them as they made their great escape. From there on out the machine was chained to the truck. Lots of stuff that has been mentioned already. I will add, having to walk several blocks to an area where delivery drivers, like pizza, would meet you because they would not go further into your neighborhood. Same with cabs / Ubers. Knowing who belongs there is a big one. You know who the regular dealers are etc. If you see a new person around that raises suspicion because they could be trouble. Keeping the possessions you really cared about locked up, not in car, in home, because break-ins happen. I personally kept my Poe's car unlocked because I could not afford to replace broken window. Nothing in it was worth anything and it never has gotten stolen. Before I had a car, getting groceries was hard. Like another person said, grocery stores were not close by, just overpriced ghetto marts, corner stores. Even catching a bus was hard because there was less service in my area than in other parts of the city. Violence was present, but not something that bothered me. Maybe I was used to it. I have had an armed escort home several times when I found myself in the middle of a gang dispute. Each time a few fellows who knew I lived near called a truce of sorts and would walk me home. Not that I was particularly special, I think they did that to others who happened to be out late. Grew up in a rough area of North Las Vegas. One of our apartment neighbors was this guy that ran with a Mexican gang and sold drugs. One day my brother and I are playing in front of our door when we see about 3 biker dudes roll up. They knock on the door and politely ask our neighbor's wife if her husband was home. She says yes, and he comes to the door. Within seconds they yank him from his doorstep and proceed to beat him up with pipes they pulled out of seemingly nowhere. He's screaming pleading for help, wherein steps neighbor #2. This guy was about as hardcore gangbanger as you can get. He screams down and says he's coming, at which time the bikers proceed to run out towards the parking lot. They haven't reached the lot when shots ring out. Boom. 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 Glass shatters and you can hear bullets hitting steel. Neighbor #2 legit tried to murder these dudes in front of us. By now my mom is screaming, rounding us up to come inside. We go upstairs to write out the police questioning that will follow. The cops show up and knock, but my mom refuses to open the door. We never talked to police. That is how you survive in those places. If it doesn't involve you, you saw nothing. Even if it did, you still didn't see anything. Very memorable part of my childhood. Couple years ago I was leaving my house for uni when I heard a huge bashing sound coming from my neighbor's house, who I didn't know well, but had always seen around and chatted to occasionally. I lived with my bro, and it was a rough neighborhood with lots of break-ins and fights, so I always tried to keep my head down and be polite. Anyway, I had a look and saw a guy, who later turned out to be a plainclothes policeman, with a battering ram breaking into the house. Police then swarmed the house and removed about 4 women who looked like they had been abused, a whole bunch of dudes, and a shit ton of drugs and weapons. Turns out they were running a brothel and had been monitored by police for months. I knew something dodgy was going on because guys would come and go in the middle of the night and could always smell weed, but I had no idea it was that serious. Turns out they were keeping the women hooked on drugs and threatened them if they ever leaves the house. Scary stuff. Was always polite to them and kept my head down whenever possible. This was in the UK, but I guess the same thing would work anywhere else. Never lived in one, but I was a mailman in a really bad neighborhood for a couple years and saw a lot of interesting things. Drug dealing and robbery was rampant. I kept my mouth shut and the drug dealers in that neighborhood made sure I wasn't ever messed with. Since I delivered the paychecks and welfare checks, I wasn't to be touched. That's how they made their money, so it made perfect sense to protect me. I never had anyone give me any serious trouble. Couple of verbal spats here and there, but the ones I had to legitimately fear were the ones I was cool with. They let me do my job, I'll let them do this. I felt like an extra on the set of The Wire. My mother used to manage and live in a motel in a really shitty neighborhood. She got cancer and became too sick to work anymore, but didn't want to move away from her home. So I came back from college to take care of her until she passed, which also entailed managing the motel. The motel also served as a long-term apartment solution for many people, and we had people who lived there perpetually for months or even years. In my time as manager, there was a double homicide and 2 attempted suicides, in contrast to her time there, in which there was a single homicide and 3 attempted suicides. She was there much longer, however. This was all in addition to many other similar events. Lots of various assault charges, drug charges, lots of property damage, etc. from the tenants that lived there, not to mention just lots of general unruliness. I was on a first name basis with most of the regular cops. One of the most glaring things that stayed with me from there was just the intensity with which people lie. I mean, everyone knows people lie a shitload, but every single day someone would just come up with the stupidest, most implausible lies and expect me to believe them. You don't have your rent for this week because your boss randomly decided not to pay you? Bro, I can literally smell your room from the service hallway through the bathroom vent. That isn't a plastic bag you're burning in there, it's crack. Of course, calling every single person out on their bullshit constantly is a fantastic way to get shot, so I'd often give them a day or 2, and then tell them the owner told me to give them the boot, and just let the cops handle it if they objected. Even being personable, I unavoidably made some enemies that I would rather not have, simply due to the nature of the job. Sorry, can't rent to you man. You're on the blacklist. Why the fuck? Because we found some paraphernalia in the room. Because you literally threw your fucking heroin needles away in the bathroom garbage without even putting a fucking bag in at first. Oh yeah, I saw those when I was in there. Was going to tell you about that. They were there when I rented the room. Wasn't me. I have hundreds of stories from that awful place. I could write a book. Glad I'm out now, though. For once I actually have a story to comment. So the one thing that stays with me from home happened on Christmas Day evening when I was 8, when a woman we'd never seen before knocked on our door and told us there was a dead body outside our house. Now I live in a rough area, drugs, gangs, the occasional rape and often GBH. but any murders normally happened on the other side of my estate. But this time, someone had been murdered about 6 feet away from our front door, just outside the front garden, and hidden by the garden wall. It was dark, and his body was half in the road, and covered by his raincoat and the shopping bags he'd been carrying. So nobody had noticed it. It was Christmas Day. Everyone was inside with their families. The woman who found him only noticed she'd nearly run him over with her car. The poor bloke had been stabbed 3 times in the back, but nobody had witnessed it. I live near a school, so they checked the security cameras and eventually figured out that he'd actually been attacked about 500 yards away and had walked all that way before collapsing outside my house. It was quite an experience for me as there were police everywhere, TV crews, search dogs. We weren't allowed to leave the house for a week in case we disturbed evidence. If we did go out, we had to sign in and sign out with a liaison officer at the end of the street. As an 8-year-old, I couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. I just knew that someone was dead, and it wasn't an accident. Eventually, they found the murder weapon in a neighbor's garden and found the murderer from the prints. He was a local gang leader who'd killed his best friend he'd been having an affair with his GF. They'd argued as they were on their way home from the corner shop, and the guy had just attacked his friend and run off. The victim was in so much shock he'd kept walking until he finally died. I never did find out who he was. I can't remember the specifics, but that Christmas will always stick with me. I grew up with drive-by shootings and gang activity in general. I feel like a lot of important childhood memories are interlaced with weird neighborhood shit. The day we got our first puppy, my friend across the street pulled a gun on his dad. When the cops showed up, he ran down the street and turned the gun on himself. Everyone was fine that day, but I'll never forget having a new puppy and not being able to take it to the bathroom because we could get shot. I also learned to treat everyone with respect. People were stabbed to death next door. Drive-bys hit the house 2 doors down. No one ever shot us though. People looked out for us. In junior high I was chased home often by men yelling that they'd pay me for my services. In high school my family worked nights and I was home alone. At this point my friend across the street just got out of prison and was pissed I was home alone. He called in a favor with the Hells Angels and they patrolled my street at night. My mom said oftentimes she'd come home just as 2 motorists would drive away. They protected me for a few years. How normal it seemed until I was out from under that. You grow up knowing how to stay off the radar and not bother the wrong people. You see wild, crazy, scary things on the regular and learn to keep your mouth shut and pretend you didn't. You are just a kid, like any other kid, but you have to be preternaturally aware of the relationships and hierarchies and happenings around you all the time to make sure you don't end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, there was a guy who let his big mean dogs, I don't remember the breed, run loose in the neighborhood, but the dogs respected boundaries in terms of how close you could get to their house before you got your throat torn out. Stay far enough aware, and they just sat watching you, with the occasional menacing growl. I spent the year we lived there thinking it was perfectly normal that I couldn't walk home from school on that one side of the street on penalty of death. It's just what happens. It's just your normal.